How are we doing, guys? And welcome back to Tifosi Nation TV. As the title says on this video, we are analysing pace today. Pace. Qualifying pace, race pace, and teammate pace compared for each of the 10 teams and ranked as well. So I've gone through the numbers. I've crunched the numbers on race pace. I apologise this video is a little bit late, but it's better late than never on this new Ferrari and McLaren fan channel. So we're going to analyse the 10 teams today. And there is some very interesting data. And I'm going to go through each of the 10 teams. So let's start with Alpine. No surprises here. They rank last, both on qualifying pace and race pace. Qualifying pace, around 1.4 seconds off Ferrari. Shockingly bad from Alpine in that regard. And even worse when it comes to race pace. 2.1 seconds per lap on average behind Red Bull. So they're a long way off. It's not even like they're particularly close to the teams ahead of them. Sauber, for example, on qualifying pace, have still got a good 10th on them, and Sauber are really struggling, it seems, on qualifying pace. And the Williams are also at least a 10th faster than Alpine on race pace. So there's big concerns there for Alpine. They are not particularly close in either regard to the other teams, really. There is definitely an island between them and the other 9 teams in F1 at this moment in time. Esteban Ocon definitely had, for me, looking through the data, the edge on Pierre Gasly, particularly in qualifying, just under 2 tenths up on Gasly in terms of qualifying pace, although it didn't really achieve Ocon much, 19th. But again, it's a small little victory for Ocon over Gasly because we know how big that rivalry is. I expect that rivalry to get more and more challenging to manage over the season, particularly if Alpine do continue to struggle. I think it will just become a case of Ocon and Gasly. The determination and the only sort of motivation in F1 for them will be finishing in front of each other. But Ocon did seem to have the edge. In race pace, it was very, very close, though. Again, we're talking, you can see in the data how close it was in terms of race pace. There wasn't really much at all between them in that kind of regard. But Ocon did have the slight edge in terms of qualifying pace, but Alpine, by far, the worst, both in race trim and quali trim. Not really much more to talk about in terms of them. Now, let's talk about just about better than Alpine in terms of race pace was Williams, averaging around 1.9 seconds slower than Red Bull. Better in qualifying, though. Definitely better in qualifying. Around the 8th fastest in qualifying. But again, it's not great from Williams. In terms of where they were last season, the momentum they haven't quite carried it forward into this season. Obviously, on both cars, with some of this race pace data, again, there's certain nuances to consider. Certainly on Williams, in terms of obviously the steering wheel issue on both cars, actually, but especially Logan Sargent's. So I have very much picked up the data on Logan Sargent for the first 10 laps before the steering wheel issue kicks in, because I think anything else beyond that isn't really particularly accurate. I think Sargent did refer to bringing the car home really being his target after that. So Williams around 1.9 seconds slower on race pace and 1 second slower on qualifying pace. So they are struggling. It is going to be a tough battle for Williams to be consistent point scorers this season, although maybe in a better position than they were this time last year. But they're going to need big development once again. In terms of teammates, again, clear edge once again to Albon. Similar theme from last season, just under 4 tenths up on qualifying pace and around 3 tenths up on race pace. So, yeah, certainly Albon looks comfortable once again in terms of that partnership. There was talk about Logan Sargent making improvements this season, and to be fair, again, he kept it clean in the race. But that qualifying wasn't great from Logan Sargent. It was a big underperformance in terms of where the car was at. Maybe not a big underperformance, but it was an underperformance. It certainly had a Q2 potential in that car. But on race pace, the Williams did struggle and was probably only just better than Alpine by a 10th or so. Next, Racing Bulls. Now, Racing Bulls, probably around 8th in terms of race pace. They weren't great. And I think it's one of those racing balls. I think it was the expectation that we came into the season with, and that expectation hasn't totally disappeared. It might have just been a bad race in terms of for the car and the track that might not have quite suited the characteristics of this racing ball's car. But yeah, in terms of race pace, it wasn't great. 1.7 seconds on average, a lap slower than Red Bull in that kind of sense. And yeah, not a particularly great one from Racing Bulls. I think I certainly expected them to be a lot closer to Aston Martin, at the very least sixth, before the weekend started. But yeah, they were around 1.7 seconds a lap slower on average. Quali pace was better, just under 9/10 behind Ferrari in that kind of regard. Not too bad. Seventh, kind of in terms of pace on quali trim. But again, you expect more from Racing Bulls, and maybe we'll see more from Racing Bulls in Saudi. But so far, not a big improvement on last season, and probably not much better than where they were from the end of last season, really. Last season they did start to pick up a little bit. It felt, if anything, like maybe a step back a little bit in that regard. Yuki had the edge in qualifying, around 1.5 tenths up on Danny Ricciardo. On race pace, again, there wasn't much in it. Different strategies, of course, making it more difficult to kind of compare race paces. But in general, it was quite even. Maybe Danny Rick, the slight edge, but really this was very much even on race pace. Next up, we have Zauber. Okay, Zauber is one where it gets a bit more interesting. There's a bit more variation here with that Zauber. So there was 7th on race pace, 1.5 seconds down on pace over the 57 laps. Quali pace, though, was very poor. Very poor from Zauber. Both cars went out in Q1, of course, and I don't think there was much more to achieve from that car, really. It felt it was around 1.3 seconds short of Ferrari in terms of qualifying pace. But on race pace, it was better. It didn't seem too harsh in its tyres. It didn't seem to have issues with tyre degradation anywhere near as much as the teams kind of below Aston Martin in that midfield. They seem to be the best on their tyres. And yeah, there was definitely race pace there with Zauber. I would rank him around 7th on that kind of regard. Zhou Guanyu, absolutely dominant over Valtteri Bottas on race day. Just under 6 tenths up on Bottas on average race pace, and that's accounting for Bottas's 52-second pit stop. It just wasn't. I think almost as a case of with Bottas, he's been let off a little bit with a poor performance on Sunday. Because of that 52-second delay in terms of his pit stop, but his pace was shocking all race really on the 57 laps. Quali pace, it was a lot closer. In fact, it was 1,000th of a tenth. That was 1,000th of a second, sorry, between Bottas and Zhou Guanyu on quali pace, so pretty even there. But the Zauber is definitely struggling in that regard. That's where there's a big differential. Looks decent in race pace. There's potentially points in that car. Zhou Guanyu, of course, finishing 11th and at times was in the points. But fundamentally, there's definitely qualifying pace to find in that car. Next up, we have Haas, who in both quali pace and race pace were the best of the midfield, which is very surprising considering the initial hype this season was that they were going to be where Alpine find themselves. But yeah, the car, as like last season, looks good in quali pace. Just under 8 tenths down on Ferrari in that regard, but by quite a distance, the best of the midfield in terms of qualifying pace. Nico Hulkenberg, as he did last season, absolutely fantastic in qualifying again, got the absolute maximum out of the car, getting into Q3, and was just under 7 tenths up on K-Mag. And it was a totally dominant weekend from Nico Hulkenberg in terms of in comparison to K-Mag. And it wasn't like K-Mag had a particularly disastrous weekend. It's just Hulkenberg produced a masterclass, really. 7 tenths up on qualifying pace and 5 tenths up on race day. But ultimately, Nico Hulkenberg made that big mistake on lap 1 where he collided into Lance Stroll. If that hadn't have happened, there's a genuine case. Well, I think it's inevitable Nico Hulkenberg would have ended up with points. I think he would have split the Aston Martins, maybe even finished ahead of both Aston Martins, because although he was behind, he started 4 places behind Fernando Alonso. I'm just going to get my data up here. He was actually quicker on race day than both Aston Martins. And is that down to the car? A little bit, but it's also down to Nico Hulkenberg getting the absolute maximum out of it. And this Haas car is definitely easier on its tyres now. because the race pace was pretty similar to the qualifying pace, which hasn't been the case for Haas for years upon years upon years. They seem to have got on top of that under Komatsu. It seems to be the main priority of the Haas development, but they've kept the qualifying pace as well. So they seem the best place to get points out of the midfield, to break up that top 5 teams. And as I said, Nico Hulkenberg was faster on race day than both Aston Martins, which is very, very notable. And probably the most notable thing in terms of the data all weekend. If only Nico, if only. Poor mistake at the start, but ultimately recovered well and was levels above K-Mag on the race weekend. So that was probably the biggest differential in terms of teammates all weekend, was between Nico and K-Mag. In 5th, and by a long way 5th, because they're miles away from 4th and they're quite a bit ahead of Haas in terms of qualifying pace, is Aston Martin. 4 tenths down on Ferrari, but 4 tenths up on Haas. So, they maybe not a million miles away from McLaren on qualifying pace, but over the weekend, it's the gap certainly extended in terms of race pace. And it was something Fernando Alonso was concerned about all weekend. They're around 1.2 seconds down on Red Bull, which is shocking compared to where they were this time last year and for the first half of last season. Alonso had the measure of Lance Stroll in qualifying, 4 tenths up. But on race day, Lance Stroll came back quite a bit. It was pretty much even. The smallest of margins in favour of Fernando Alonso. Of course, I've already alluded to Nico Hulkenberg's error at the start, which took out Lance Stroll. But Lance Stroll recovered well and was lapping at a very, very similar rate to Fernando Alonso. But this Aston Martin team, it doesn't feel like they're going to drop off, but it also doesn't feel like they're going to move up, because they are 4 tenths behind McLaren on race pace at this moment in time, which is a long, long way. 4th is, as I said, McLaren, both in race trim and qualifying pace. They're ranked around 4th. 3 tenths down on qualifying, 7 tenths down on race pace. Now, this could be down to the fact that the McLaren doesn't particularly suit the Bahrain circuit. It did better than certainly did a lot better than what it has done in the last 2 years, but Lando alluded to the track being too twisty and too many slow speed corners, which of course hasn't suited that McLaren for a long, long time. Certainly last season, it feels like it's a similar car and an evolution of the car from last season. It doesn't feel like a complete change with this McLaren car. So Saudi might suit them better, but certainly on race pace and qualifying pace, they were the 4th team. But Lando had a big gap. Well, a smaller gap than maybe last season, but still had a considerable gap on Oscar Piastri in terms of race pace, just under 2 tenths up on Oscar on the Saturday. Qualifying pace, again, as the same theme from last season, Oscar was much, much closer, just under a tenth down on Lando. Whether there was more to come from that McLaren car in qualifying pace, Lando and Oscar both alluded to the fact that they could have got, either the second row or maybe even the first row with the McLaren. Not sure if there's a lot of evidence of that on the data, but we'll see. We'll see in the later races to come. 3rd is Mercedes. Again, both on qualifying pace and race pace. The qualifying pace was much better from the Mercedes to what it has been in the last 2 seasons. Again, still a long way off Ferrari and Red Bull, but closer than what it has been before. Just under 3 tenths down in that regard. And George Russell produced a fantastic lap out of it. 2 tenths up on Lewis in qualifying, 3rd on the grid. Very impressive performance. Much closer on race day between Russell and Hamilton. Hamilton had much more traffic, but was able to lap at similar rates to George Russell. In the end, George did have the better weekend, there's no doubt about it. But I don't think some of the narratives about Hamilton being washed and Ferrari made this big mistake are big exaggerations. Hamilton still had race pace on the Saturday. There's no question about that. And it's not a massive surprise to see George Russell outqualify Lewis Hamilton. It has been a theme of the last 2 years. But the Mercedes is still a long way off in race pace. Just under 7 tenths down on Red Bull. There's work to do there, definitely. Of course, we do need to factor in the engine cooling issue on both cars. That obviously could have cost Mercedes a couple of tenths, but there's no doubt about it. We have to also consider the fact that Ferrari in front of them had a good 3 tenths on Mercedes with brake issues on Charles' car. Every team, apart from Red Bull, really did have issues on the car. So it's tough to have an exact read on how far back Mercedes are, but it feels like they're still a long way back and maybe not quite made the progress that I expected them to make. Qualifying pace more encouraging, but race pace didn't look great, even accounting for the engine cooling issues. Ferrari next, I'm going to talk about. Ferrari feel equal to Red Bull now on qualifying pace. And it's not just based on this race and the data of this race. It's based on pretty much since Qatar. Charles Leclerc has finished on the started on the first row in the last 6 races. Yeah, that isn't a fluke. We know how good Charles is a qualifier, but you can't just keep outperforming the car like that. This Ferrari has genuinely got excellent qualifying pace. Disappointing for a Ferrari fan, if you couldn't tell. Point of view in terms of race pace on the Saturday. Now, of course, brake issues on Charles' car. Carlos got within 3 seconds of Perez, and maybe without the traffic of having to overtake Charles twice and George Russell, maybe Sainz could have closed that gap. I think it still would have been a tall order, but it wasn't a million miles off. It wasn't unthinkable that Carlos Sainz could have finished second in the race. And maybe Charles Leclerc could have finished second in the race without the brake issue, because Charles Leclerc was lapping pretty well towards the end of the race. But yeah, in terms of qualifying pace, Ferrari actually were quicker than Red Bull on average, and Charles actually put together the best lap of qualifying in Q2. Obviously, couldn't replicate it in Q3, whether that was down to Leclerc underperformance or poor strategy. Even accounting for that, Ferrari were quicker on qualifying pace. Not by a lot, pretty equal, but just about quicker. So I do expect Leclerc and Verstappen, it could be interesting in terms of, well, it might be more interesting on Fridays and Saturdays than Sundays this season in terms of qualifying pace. But yeah, Leclerc had a good 10th on Carlos Sainz in terms of qualifying pace. And the race pace is much more difficult to read, obviously, because of Charles' issue with the brakes. But just going off the raw data, again, tongue-in-cheek, don't take this too far. But Sainz had 3 temps on Leclerc. Again, how much of that was down to the brakes, we don't know. I can only go off the data we've got in front of us, and Sainz had 3 temps on Leclerc. I personally don't think it really probably would have been that much. I think it probably been pretty equal without the brake issue, but that's what the data shows anyway. And the fastest, no surprises here, Red Bull. Although they're not totally dominant in qualifying, there is still domination in the race. 4 temps up on Ferrari, 7 temps up on the next closest. There's definite race pace in that for Red Bull. There's no doubt about that. Qualifying maybe less dominant, but Max Verstappen still had 3.5 temps on Perez, and this is one of Perez's best qualifyings in a long, long time. And he only finished 5th, and that shows how far Checo Perez has been off in qualifying. But Max had 3.5 temps still on Checo in qualifying, and on race pace it was pretty similar as well. 3 temps on Checo, as both really cruised to a first and second in the end. Definite race pace there. Could Ferrari get closer if they get on top of that brake issue on Charles' car? Who knows? But off the raw data, Red Bull is definitely still the team to beat. But yeah, that is the general analysis, guys. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. I think the most interesting pick-outs here are genuinely Nico Hulkenberg lapping faster than the Aston Martins on race day. The Haas being strong on its tyres still. Now being strong on its tyres and still being strong in qualifying still. And the Alpines are absolutely shocking. I think that is the analysis you can pick from this anyway, guys. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe button, and let us know in the comments down below if you want more videos like this and how we can make this as interesting as possible for you guys. Thanks very much for watching. I've been Oscar from Tifosi Nation TV. Check out our other videos, and we'll see you later. Cheers, guys.